So, Tomás, maybe you want to say something about what you have said, what have been said before, sorry, and then you move on. I'm very happy to welcome a representative of Argentina because it's an interesting country, new president, new regulation, huge resources. So, of course. Of course. Please, you have the floor, Tomás.
Thank you, Valérie. Good afternoon. It's really an honor to be here, and thanks for the invitation. If I come from Argentina, it's a 20-hour flight, 14,000 kilometers distance, and I work as a lawyer and in many energy projects, hydro projects, even nuclear projects, and renewable and gas projects in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and even Uruguay. So I sort of come to tell a case study, or a story of the Argentine energy plan. I will read to stick to 7 minutes, okay? Yeah. Argentina has the determination of contributing to global security of supply and the mitigation of climate change through its vast natural resources while carrying out its own energy transition. Just a few facts to introduce my country, at least from an energy perspective. We're a federal republic. A new administration took office 1 year ago. Maybe you heard about President Milei, a free market revolutionary and a disruptor who happens to be an ally of President Trump. We're 47 million people, fifth in America, and have a 630 billion economy. It's the second largest in South America. We're about to produce 1 million barrels of oil per day, and we're exporting 50% of those volumes. We're producing 150 million cubic meters of gas per day. We're exporting 10% of that production to Chile and Brazil. We have a balanced energy mix, no coal, lots of hydro, lots of nuclear, and renewables, which in aggregate represent 40% of our energy mix. We produce only 0.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and our current NDC pledges not to exceed net emissions of 360 million tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. Today, I want to focus on the energy plan of Argentina, its main assumptions, fundamentals, and its action points. So what is the plan? In 10 years, Argentina intends to export around 25 billion metric tons per annum through several LNG projects located over its Atlantic coastline. This would entail duplicating our current production. In the midterm, 5 years from now, and thanks to already installed interconnection pipeline capacity, we expect to export around 30 million cubic meters of gas per day to Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, and Bolivia. In respect of its neighbors in the southern cone, Argentine gas will substitute mainly coal, in the case of Chile, liquid fuels, and imported LNG, and as an insurance in drought seasons, in the case of Brazil, fuel oil in the case of Bolivia, and as a backup of wind energy in the case of Uruguay. In respect of its potential LNG off-takers, the government and the Argentine gas industry are embarking in trade negotiations with the EU, Brazil, China, India, and other Asian countries. In fact, with the EU and Brazil, we already signed MOUs. The main assumptions of this plan are the following. First, the shale rock is there. Its productivity is even better than Permian, and development costs are being reduced constantly. The Vaca Muerta shale gas formation is considered the world's second largest shale gas deposit with 300 plus TCF of resources. Break-even prices are around $2 per million BTU, comparable to those in the US. Second, Argentine gas has a low carbon intensity. As McKinsey recently reported, Vaca Muerta's production processes are among the lowest carbon intensity for oil and gas operations worldwide. Third, the global energy transition will need Argentine LNG. Towards 2030 and onwards, the gap between projected demand and supply, including existing under construction and projects with FID, will be around 100 million tons per annum and growing. I defer to you. Let's finalize with the action points of the Argentine energy plan. First, regulatory action. During the past 10 years, Argentina has modernized its legislation to foster shale gas massive development. It has amended its hydrocarbons law to cap royalties and extend the life of exploitation concessions. It has amended its midstream regulations to allow contract carrier pipelines financed through shipper pay, long-term and firm contracts. Finally, it created an investment promotional regime that reduces taxes, eliminates currency controls, and provides numerous stability clauses, such as firm export rights and tax stability for 30 years. Now is the time for investors and financing institutions to believe or not in these regulatory promises. Second, Argentina arranged what I call the domestic business environment. First, it reduced labor costs by negotiating with unions, carrot and stick incentives in the relevant collective bargaining agreements. Second, it secured long-term gas supply to the domestic market by fostering long-term contracts between producers and domestic off-takers, mainly power generators and distribution companies serving residential users. Third, gas tariffs reflect the actual cost of natural gas. Put simply, Argentina is gradually eliminating energy subsidies. Third and finally, Argentina is decarbonizing its energy mix through a series of cumulative measures. One, increase wind and solar power installed capacity by unbundling the sector and allowing PPAs between producers and any type of energy consumers, both large and small, and by expanding the grid to reach isolated places with enormous wind potential. Interesting fact, in Patagonia, the capacity factors of our wind farms are around 70%. Two, replace fuel oil power generators with combined cycle gas-fired generators through the construction of gas pipelines to move the Vaca Muerta gas to the big industrial cities of Argentina. If we consider past and future conversions, we're talking about 10 gigawatts of power plants that now feed from gas rather than fuel oil. Three, reduce domestic emissions by establishing a cap-and-trade carbon market, sort of copying the emissions trading system of Europe, fostering domestic RED Plus jurisdictional programs, developing CCS projects in salt caverns in Bahia Blanca and depleted gas fields in Neuquén, and mandating methane reduction targets over the oil and cattle industries. As you know, each country is devising its own energy transition, considering its energy mix baseline, its natural resources endowment, and its economic possibilities. All these decarbonization measures require capital and financing, and the goal of Argentina is to finance part of that energy transition through its LNG experts. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Majdi, yes, please.
Thank you very much. I had just three short comments. First, we are in Argentina investing a lot, so I support and I totally agree with you. Second, I had a question about the nuclear and the SMR. Are they vulnerable? Are there any problem with any? I mean, we just remember Fukushima and you know the dérèglement climatique, all the catastrophic events. Mm-hmm. Is there any risk there? And third, I'd like to come back to methane and just say that there is an issue. The issue with torching also is very, very important because we can use this gas to produce electricity, to use it with renewable. That's what we're doing in Iraq, and it is working. And so it's really, it's not just for the planet, which is very, very important, but it's also for the countries that these gases can be used to produce electricity and help the country to have a better balance sheet.
Tomás, you want to comment or reply? Or?
No, just maybe on nuclear, because maybe Argentina is not that known for nuclear, but it's part of the International Organization of Nuclear Countries. But we have 3 reactors, and we developed technology for small reactors of 25 megawatts. Maybe the gentleman in the room knows about that. But there's social license for that. So we think that Argentina will grow that, but I think that the elephant in the room in nuclear is the capital cost of that. I just read the last nuclear reactors in UK, and it takes 15 years and more than 10 billion to build a nuclear reactor. So I think that's the elephant in the room for nuclear to me.
Jeffrey, yes. Sorry, Jeffrey.
Yeah, thanks. That's interesting. I have a couple of questions. When you say that natural gas will no longer be subsidized for local consumption and would be sold at its actual cost, do you mean at the international price? Because if you're going to have the alternative of selling through via LNG exports or pipeline to Chile, will the domestic market be paying the same price as the export market, or will there be an inherent subsidy in the domestic market?
Wow, that's a big question, right? And the U.S. made that question or that dilemma, right? And probably the Henry Hub is still low in spite of all the exports, right? So the U.S. helps to answer that question, at least for Argentina, because it's going to compare with what happened in the U.S. market. But what I can tell you is that we exported around 30 million cubic meters back in the 90s. And those exports and those long-term contracts with Chile and Brazil did not affect domestic prices, which is a big market,
Weren't those contracts ultimately breached because the gas was
fully, and maybe the answer exactly, and maybe the answer is because at some point when populism arrived in Argentina in the 2000s, in the commodity boom, etc., the government interfered in gas prices, in domestic gas prices, and exacerbated gas demand, and it was similar to Venezuela with the crude oil price and fuels, and exacerbated gas demand. So what the government now is doing is that the gas prices reflect the actual cost, those break-even prices that I'm talking about, so we do not exacerbate demand. And at the same time, producers also have intention to sell to the domestic market because it's a 150 million domestic market. It's good. So if the export contracts will compete to the domestic market, we still need to see that. If you base on the U.S., I think it's going to be a successful story. But at the same time, what the regulation establishes, the new regulation, is that the export permits will not be interfered once they are granted. So those contracts will be protected.
And so, if I may,
please,
that means that your prices,
no,
your prices would be pretty much like a Henry Hub prices?
Argentina is a very liquid market. The almost the 24 provinces are connected to the grid. So it's the second largest country in gas penetration after Russia. So what I'm saying here is that as long as the government allows the cost of gas, those break-even prices, to be transferred to the residential users and power plants, it's not going to be a problem.
Well, won't the problem be that if I'm producing gas and I can sell it at a higher price by exporting it, then why would I sell it at cost domestically? I guess that's the problem, because if you're just not that, and that's that would happen in the situation that you talked about with Chile. You're right. There was tons of export gas to Chile, but what happened was it eventually started to choke the supply domestically, and so the gas was diverted and the contracts were breached. And the reason why I think that was happening was gas producers weren't able to get the same price domestically as they were internationally. So it'll be interesting to see how the policy
of course.
evolves.
Just 30% of the domestic market is regulated. The other 70% is free. It's industries, it's mining companies. The Argentine government would not be interested in protecting copper industries. The gas they will price is going to be freely negotiated. The same with power plants. So the problem is limited to 30%. So I don't see that such a big problem. Of course, every exporting country except the US has a domestic gas supply obligation. So maybe when they issue those extra permits, they establish, okay, at least 30% of production must be rerouted to the domestic market.
I've got two questions or two comments. Sir, and then Arash.
Yeah, if you can close off your mic, please.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I wanted to be back on what you mentioned regarding the cost of nuclear reactors. I do not fully agree with what you mentioned. You have to keep in mind that if you build only 1 or 2 reactors, for sure it's going to cost a lot. You need to industrialize the process. And it's what we already achieved in the past in France with success. It's what China is doing right now. And when you have a look on China, they are able to build a reactor in due time and due cost. It means between 4 and 5 years, and the overall cost, overnight cost at the end is really competitive. So I can give you more information if you want. I was a nuclear counselor at the French embassy in China, so I follow this program very precisely.
No, okay. Arash?
Just to come back to that price issue, also your question, obviously if you start exporting to Chile, you're going to have less supply. I mean, this is basically, if it's a given that you're pursuing free market policies, right? So obviously the supply will be going down in Argentina during that time, which will drive up the price once again, so the market can recalibrate in that sense, right? So I'm sure they've got that rationale behind that policy. Regarding nuclear, real quick, I think it's a fact that there hasn't been a single, nuclear plant that's been constructed ever in history without subsidies. So that might also be in the calculation of a more free market type government. So in that sense, I think that's something that you're going to have to keep into consideration.